Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners Board Briefing. Audience members, I want to start by asking you to please silence your electronic devices. Today's meeting is a hybrid board meeting. Some presenters and guests will appear in person and some will appear virtually. For those presenting virtually, please mute your mic when not speaking. When presenting, make sure to unmute your mic and turn on your camera. For all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. So we're having two board items today. The first is going to be a board briefing on the See No Stranger Oregon Department of Human Services Welcome Center Transition Project. So we're going to do that first with folks coming up to the table to present, and we'll stay up here, and then we'll take the short recess so that we can move down to the table so that we can have more of a work session as we're talking about the SHS unanticipated dollars. So that's what it's going to look like for today. So we'll go ahead and get started with the ODHS Welcome Center Transition Projects. I'm really glad that we have a chance to have this briefing today. This is really about the work that has been happening so far to provide support to our immigrant, refugee, and asylee population in Multnomah County and Oregon since November of last year. The briefing is about the human lives and the impact to those lives as people are coming into this country and this county. It's about how we are there to help people as they're making that transition, making that huge move. There's no greater work that we do at Multnomah County than to be a true safety net for the most vulnerable among us. And so the briefing today is going to be followed on Thursday by a budget modification to provide approval of the funds to collaborate with the state to transition the Welcome Center and the Hugo Hotel. I really want to say how much I appreciate the work of our government relations team and our Department of County Human Services teams in helping us navigate this situation and to come up with a really solid transitional plan in partnership with the Oregon Department of Human Services. I'm really grateful for the partnership with the state as we have been doing this work and continuing to have discussions about long-term plans for the ways that we're able to support our refugee, immigrant, and asylee populations here in Oregon. And we're going to start today's briefing with some information from Justin, from our government relations team, who's going to talk a little bit about the history of the situation before we're briefed more fully on this plan and the transitional services that we're going to be offering 300 households in Multnomah County. So Justin, I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Chair. For the record, my name is Justin Black. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at Multnomah County. I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourself now or when you talk. Okay, great. As the chair said, my goal today is just to give a little history and a little overview of the legislative side of this and our work with both the governor's office and DHS at the state level. To go back, in the fall of 2022, the state set up the Hugo Welcome Center in East Portland. It was in response to the number of immigrants and refugees that were coming to the area without a place to go, to get services, to get connected to services, to get connected to housing and other things. The state set that up. It was very expensive, not necessarily the most efficient way to handle it all, and really came to the conclusion very quickly that they needed to ramp it down, shut it down, and come up with a longer-term solution on how to connect refugees and immigrants who are coming to the state to services, both here in the metro area and statewide. We began a discussion with the governor's office and DHS in the winter of 2022 on what was going to happen. There was not a concrete plan at that point on how the center would be ramped down, who would take responsibility for services, and who would lead the work on creating a statewide and local plan. We had great collaboration. I'm not going to say it was easy at every moment. There were definitely disagreements as we did this work, but I think at the end of the day, the governor's office, DHS, and Multnomah County were committed to making it work, which helped. We brought in some external stakeholders to help along with the conversation, looked at a variety of different ways to solve this. And then I will say, I think one of the things that I really saw through this process was from community members and DHS and the governor's office, just a real appreciation for the work that Multnomah County does, and the understanding that Multnomah County works very well with our local CBOs. That there was a desire to have us included in this process because of their faith in how we do that work and how we engage community. We continued working. We realized that we could not do this without additional resources. We worked with the governor's office and the legislature to identify, kind of a broad budget for the work that would happen. Also, a timeline. We wanted to make sure that Multnomah County wasn't taking on additional work without the resources and the leverage to make that work happen and be successful at it at the end of the day, because that is the number one. We want to be successful in this work that's happened. And I will say, much credit to my colleagues here at DCHS who did a tremendous amount of planning work and really in the weeds work with DHS to come up with a viable plan in IGA. I mean, I really cannot say enough about the work that they did in this. From the GR perspective, we just got to come in and kind of ruffle feathers and push on things, but the real work happened over here at DCHS. So that is kind of a broad overview of our work at the governor's level and at the legislative level. I will pass it on to my colleagues.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Mohammed Bader. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director for the Department of County Human Services. I'm just going to be very brief in my comments because I'll turn it over to Mary Lee. I just wanted to talk about why DCHS is interested in working with the state in this project. It really is within the core and mission of what we do as a department. Not to mention that I'm myself a first-generation immigrant. I hope that you can see that this man who came to this country with $500 in one suitcase is able to help the community. And we're hoping that those individuals we help, they have a lot of talent and expertise. We've met with some of them. We have gone and talked to some of them. They bring a lot of vitality, a lot of expertise to this community. And the bulk of the work we do with ODHS is really providing that case management, that support, that connection to services. And with that, I just want to turn it to Mary Lee. She will talk more about the plan, and I'm available here since I'm one of those signed in that IGA myself. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but I'm going to turn it to Mary Lee.
Thank you, Mohammed. Good morning. Mary Lee. I use she or my name. I am Chinese American, and I work for the Department of County Human Services in the MIL, the Multnomah Idea Lab. And in our part of our special projects incubator assignments, we have gotten the assignment to work on the See No Stranger project. I want to just share with you why we chose the name See No Stranger. That was not an accident. We did that deliberately. In many, many cultures, there is this practice and sayings around the stranger and being welcome to the stranger and opening your heart and your home and your food and sharing what you have. And what we really learned as we continued to engage with the Welcome Center and the work there was there are no strangers there. We see the stranger in them, they see the stranger in us, and together we meet and move forward. And we thought that was the absolute right place for us to begin our conversations about how do we build and plan and move forward. So we've appreciated the chance to brief all of you over the last 2 weeks. I'm going to go fairly high level because I think the most important part is for you all to be able to ask the questions that you have and for us to have some discussion. We have agreed to work with the Department of Human Services to offer a transition plan for up to 300 households. And I'm saying those words, transition plan, up to households, because those are some of the places where we've had to figure out whether we're on the same page or not. We are starting with a commitment, if you think about this project in kind of three phases. The first phase has to do with the continued operation of the Welcome Center. And as Justin said, ODHS is operating the Welcome Center. They will continue to operate the Welcome Center, and they will do the ramp down of the Welcome Center exclusively through their current investments and capacity. We have been funded by the legislature to help transition approximately 197 households that are currently living at the Hugo Hotel into housing and out of the hotel, so that on December 31st, when they shut the hotel, we are doing our best to assure that no one is being released to the street nor into our homeless service systems of care. The third piece of this project that is yet to be begun, and everyone engaged knows that we need to get there, is we don't have a long-term plan as a state for how we are going to respond to new arrivals. And just because the Welcome Center is closing and we're going to house these households does not mean people have stopped coming. And the fact that the airport is in Portland and Portland is in Multnomah County doesn't mean that this is solely Multnomah County's responsibility. It is a statewide responsibility, and some might extrapolate that out to a federal conversation that needs to happen. So we fully intend to be engaged in those discussions, and we don't have a long-term plan. I want to be very clear about that. What we're doing is a transitional stopgap. The work that we are doing will be done in partnership with nonprofit organizations. The county does not intend to deliver any of these services directly. We are working with community-based organizations that are aligned with the countries of origin of the people living at the Hugo, as well as organizations that have specialty skill sets such as legal, immigration attorneys. The services that we will offer in partnership with the nonprofit organizations and with these the immigration and advocacy organizations are case management, relationship building, housing placement, rent assistance, basic income, and then access to enhanced legal community advocacy services. Again, I said that there are 197 households approximately living at the Hugo. We will look to serve those households first. And then, as we are able to, we will work with DHS to try to serve the families who are on the waiting list. There are approximately another 100 families who are on the waiting list to get into the Hugo, and if we can help, we will help with those families. The time period for this project is technically July 1st through April 1st. That is the 9 months that the legislature directed us to offer these services within. As you know, we have not yet started services. We believe that we would do this on or about September 1st. Likely, given where we've gotten to, is probably middle of September. If we are done by April 1st, we won't actually be able to serve people for as long as we've been funded. We have been in conversation with DHS around extending the service delivery date until June 30th, 2024, and we believe we'll be able to go back to the legislature with them and ask for that ability. That will not be any more funding. That will just allow us to use the funding. And if we think about it, the families that are going to get, or the households that are going to get housed closest to December 31st are likely the ones that are going to have the biggest challenge to find housing, and we will inadvertently be disadvantaging them if we house them on December 20th and then have to stop services on March 31st. So just even common sense wise, the date has to be extended, I believe. I think we've, I'm going to go into some of the current project status, and then I'll talk about some of the policy considerations or the other things we should be thinking about. We have an internal team that is both internal to DCHS and some of our central functions and service providers. We've been meeting weekly since July to get ready to be able to take this work in. As Justin alluded to, the intergovernmental agreement has been executed. It was executed in literally 48 hours, and I've never, in the entire time I've worked for the county, seen an intergovernmental agreement get fully executed to the point of signature in that amount of time. So big kudos to County Attorney, big kudos to Central Contracts and Procurement, and our internal DCHS contract staff. It's never happened. We're going through a procurement process that is requesting exemption for the nonprofit organizations that we are working with. If this project somehow continues or there's new money for it, we will go through a more regular procurement process. However, the timeline did not allow us to do anything other than accept exemption, request exemption based on the allowable purposes of that. Once the exemption has been granted and we have authority to contract, we will be moving these contracts forward as quickly as possible. We have data and evaluation plan that has been drafted. It'll get finalized once we've got authority to engage with conversation with the nonprofit organizations. We have a communications plan and talking point that we're working with Central Communications on. An external table of community members and our contracted organizations and interested people from the community will be opened in September. We are now getting ready to make sure there are so many people who are working at the Welcome Center in volunteer capacity. We want every hand to the table because this is going to be a challenge. This will not be an easy project to accomplish, although we're very confident, and we need everyone's hands to the work to be able to achieve that by the timeline. Finally, I just want to talk about a couple of the issues. There are no legal issues related to this funding. It's state general fund. There are no legal issues related to the project services, nor the role of the county. As Mohammed said, we deliver these types of services all the time. We are simply putting them in service to this population. However, there are opinions in our community and outside of our community about the role of government related to those who have newly arrived into this country, and there may be questions and comments that come there. If we don't get movement on a statewide plan that's a permanent plan, we're going to find ourselves right back in this situation sooner than we might anticipate because people continue to come. And so the urgency to be able to do whatever's possible from our perspective to encourage the governor's office, ODHS, and the state to engage sooner rather than later in this conversation of a long-term plan is critical from our perspective. And then finally, we don't, as Mohammed said, want to create an unfunded mandate. We want to make sure that we are doing the work that we need to do on behalf of our community, and we want to make sure that the limited resources that we have for many of these issues are augmented if we're going to take this on as a regular place. The final thing I'll say, and then I'll offer any comments or questions, is we are an organization. The county is an organization that if we can help, we will help. And that is part of why we're here. And we can understand that duty to help as either, sort of a values-based moral duty to help, and we can also understand it as prevention for future homelessness. Because on December 31st, if these households don't have someplace else to go, they are going into our overextended homeless systems of care at an incredible disadvantage due to language, culture, and the fact that we just don't even have the capacity to serve all those in need. And working now to help make sure these households get placement with the additional resources is a pragmatic approach to making sure that we're upstream about who's coming into our homeless systems. So I'll just close by saying I am the daughter of an immigrant. In many ways, unless we are members of indigenous communities, we are all children of immigrants, and we should embrace and move from that point to see no stranger. Thank you.
Thank you sorry. I have my prop today. Thank you so much for the presentation, for all of the work that's been happening over the last months with this. I know that I believe you've had a chance to talk with either all of the board members or their staff around this proposal, but I know that this is the first time we're able to discuss it publicly. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the board for any questions, any comments they have, and we'll start with Commissioner Myron.
It's green, that's a good sign. Thank you so much to all of you for this presentation and for the really great work that you are doing around this so important transition for people who are immigrants. I've mentioned it. I did with Commissioner Stegman's project to provide. Can't find words today, but PSAs around anti-hate messaging. I mentioned some of my background, but it is, my mom immigrated from England in her teens. Her family had virtually nothing, and she had been moving from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to escape persecution, and then to the United States with her family looking for a better life. And my father's family immigrated from Norway just before World War II, and the family that remained in Norway, over 30, 40 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. So this issue is very near and dear to my heart, and as you mentioned, to everyone's heart, aside from the Native American presence in our land. We are all immigrants, and so this welcoming work is at the core of so much of our mission at the county, as you always pointed out. And Mary, as you mentioned, this is homelessness prevention. It ties so much together, and I stand supportive of all that we can do to support those who are coming into our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Meyer. And Commissioner Jayapal.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much, certainly for the presentation, but really for the incredible work that's taken place over the last many months. For context, for those who don't know it, a little bit about my engagement with this project. I became aware of the Hugo, I think it was in early February, when I learned that the state was planning to shut it down in June. And I think I mentioned it here at the board in comments after going to visit. I think what you said, Mary, these are the key principles. This is an opportunity, and you said it too, Mohammed, and you both exemplify it. This is an opportunity. We can treat it as a crisis, and it will become a crisis if we don't plan adequately for it. But if we prepare, if we come up with a broad framework, it's an opportunity, and we will have people in our community who will go on to add to it, and they will thrive and will thrive. So, this is, in my opinion, as you said, a short-term approach. I think we've all talked about the fact that we need a long-term approach. I'm so appreciative that the state is interested in engaging in that. When we think about what the consequences are, the practical consequences that you mentioned, if we don't support these families, it is that they engage in a shelter system, and a shelter system that's not an immigration system. I've been out to the Hugo a couple of times. I heard stories about people who ended up in the shelter system who got inaccurate immigration advice that then permanently will prevent them from actually applying for asylum. That is not a criticism of shelter staff. It's just a description of the fact that our shelter system is not an immigration system. And I absolutely think this is among the most upstream things we can do to support families before they hit that system. I'll just mention a couple of the experiences I had while I was there. I talked to Afghan families who had flown from Afghanistan to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Brazil, where they got a temporary visa, but got there and learned that there was absolutely no support system for them, and then trekked from Brazil to our southern border through the Darien Gap, which is days of struggle through mud in the most inhospitable circumstances you can imagine. And one of the families I talked to had two small children, 3 and 4 years old, who had made that journey. These are people who are resilient. They shouldn't have to be this resilient, but they are resilient. And if we give them the support they need, they will thrive. And then I also talked to them about what they did in Afghanistan before they had to leave. A policeman, a journalist, an electrician, a caregiver, I don't like to focus on the skills that people bring because I think this is a moral and humanitarian imperative, but there's a practical issue here. Oregon has a workforce crisis. And again, if we support these folks, they will help us with that workforce crisis. So there's so many reasons to do this work. Really appreciate government relations for jumping in with both feet, adding this to the agenda when it wasn't there at the beginning as the issue came up, and Mohammed and Mary for all of your work and for just stepping into it, even when you have such full plates, to say, yes, this is something that we can and must stake on. So I'm very appreciative and looking forward to that long-range planning that I know we're going to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jayapal. Commissioner Broome Edwards.
Thank you. And thank you, Mary and Mohammed. I see you. And I also want to acknowledge the District 3's vibrancy, diversity, and richness. In many ways is the fact that it is home to many newcomers. And I had a chance last week just to go out to the Division Midway and meet a lot of those newcomers who, new and not so new now, but who have started businesses and are thriving in Multnomah County. I have a couple questions just because I'm new. So if you mind, first, just to clarify, the funding that came from the state, that will cover all the transition services, or is there also a component of county funding? And I want to acknowledge the brainpower and the effort that I know the county is putting into it. But are we also putting financial resources into it, or is this a total state?
I'll answer in a couple of different ways, and then Mohammed will let me know if I've missed anything. We are fully funded for 9 months of the transition package as we planned for it, right? That doesn't mean things will come up that we haven't anticipated. We're fully funded for that 9 months. The department is offering in-kind capacity for the contracting, the payment, our work, right? We're not charging anything from the state for that. We're putting it all into the families. As you know, 9 months of rent assistance is not going to make our households attractive to landlords. So, and at fair market rate, we've done some calculations. We probably are pretty close to 9 months of rent assistance. If we were able to offer another 3 to be able to work with landlords immediately to say these households, if you will take them, come with first, last 1 year's worth. That would be ideal. We don't have a source of funding for those other 3 months. We certainly want to be part of the conversation about where rent assistance might come from other funding sources into the county, but we have no commitment to do that, and we are making no assumptions around that because of all the other issues that we're having to deal with that. So yes, fully funded for up to 300, depending on the correctness of our calculations, and common sense says 9 months is not going to be as good as 12 months, and we don't have 12 months.
Yeah, but just to kind of confirm, in talking with the state, they have no intentions of forcing us to do more without funding us. So I think the answer would be like, that's, we're not committing county resources at this time.
Seems like an opportunity to go back to the state. And this is, may not be a question for you all, but just the county right now is struggling to find housing for the 6,000 plus individuals on the street. And I'm curious, how are these, it sounds like these will move to the head of the line to be placed, or how are we thinking about this as opposed to the bigger challenge that we are currently facing?
Mm-hmm. There are no plans or agreement at this time to put this population ahead, quote unquote, of anyone else in the wait lists. Once they enter the homeless system, then they are on those wait lists. So we're trying to balance those two things. There is also quite a level of community-based housing that is happening organically and volunteering. So we are going to depend on our nonprofit partners here. There is still an ability for people to do cooperative placement and living. We're looking at anything that's coming online soon to be able to get banks of of housing units. The majority of the household size living at the Hugo right now are 1 or 2 household size. So there may be opportunities to double people up. They are already living in doubled situations in some cases at the Hugo. And also to be able to look at studio options and those kinds of things. You're absolutely right. It will not be easy. We are as concerned about this as everyone is, and we are looking to leverage some of the other options that may not be available in the broader community that are available within these immigrant and refugee communities.
A couple more questions. And then I'm curious about how people are selected for this program. So we have lots of newcomers and immigrants coming in and who are navigating the system and all the challenges that come with it. And I'm curious about how we identified this particular group that gets a set of expanded services, and and a second part of that question is I'm also noticing that in the services that are offered is basic income. And I'm wondering if that was a state requirement and just the sort of feasibility and sustainability of providing that, and the sort of alternatives of, if it's a question of not having work permits, of help instead of providing people with assistance to be able to get work permits to work here, because it doesn't seem particularly sustainable. And then I'm also curious about, again, the sort of larger question of how we select out, because we're having lots of conversations, population A and B and everybody else, and so I'm trying to make sense into the larger set of services that are provided by the county.
Let me respond to your first question, which is how did households who are going to participate be identified? That was completely driven by the state legislature and by ODHS. So we are explicitly only serving households who are currently living at the Hugo Hotel. That is the 197 households that we've been referring to. The state is maintaining a waiting list for those hotel rooms at the Hugo, and as you might imagine, there is some churn. So people are being placed in housing, and more people are coming off that list. We are committing to serve that 197, this is ish, first by December 31st, and then with whatever capacity and time is left, we will negotiate with DHS for the folks who are on the waiting list. So we have made no decisions about who the households are. The only condition is that they are at the Hugo and that the state refers them to us for this very specific transition program from the legislature.
I'm sorry, did the state have some sort of criteria what criteria did the state use? Or you can follow up afterwards and just share with.
Yeah, I think that's a question we'd want to share to the state. It was an emergency management response. So if people had arrived and were living in the airport and the Port of Portland had contacted them, that was the initial reason why people got into the Hugo. So it was a completely emergency management response.
And Commissioner, sorry, we don't have a mic. I think Commissioner Darkle wanted to just provide a little bit of context for the folks that were, how the state. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not so much how the state selected, but just to clarify that this is a specific category of immigrants. This is folks who arrive and then ask for asylum. So they're categorized as asylum seekers. They have a legal right to be here. They don't have documentation or a particular status, but they have a legal right to be here. And it's part of the flow of people who are coming in across the border right now, going to lots of other parts of the country. So that relates to the work issue as well. One of the issues is that many of them are qualified to work. They can't apply for a permit until they apply for asylum. There's a long process to apply for asylum, and then once they apply for asylum, it can still take up to 9 months to get their work permit. So part of the work, the advocacy work, and I've talked to the federal delegation as well, is about getting the administration to figure out how to expedite those work permits. And again, other states have far larger issues with this than we do and are also advocating. But I think in terms of sustainability, that's a piece of the response, is that they will ultimately be able to get work permits. And many of them, not all, will be able to find work. So that, this is really a bridging. And I think the other thing that's relevant is that it's very much modeled on the federal approach to providing support to refugees. Refugees are people who've already received asylum. They come into the country. The federal government provides 9 months of this package of support, including sort of income replacement, essentially. So hope that's helpful.
Great, that's super helpful. I really appreciate it. And it sounds like there's a lot more conversations we should be having with the state and the federal government about their support of this, with Multnomah County providing sort of the backbone, but it seems like they should be providing additional resources, because 9 months seems like a very short runway and off-ramp.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Commissioner Stegman?
Thank you, Chair. Is that on? Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all sharing your personal stories. As you know, many of us are immigrants to this country, and I think we turned out pretty good. So I do have a couple of questions. So do you see any issue with extending it? Mary, you talked about going to July 1st, and where are we at in that? Is that in our IGA, and can you just talk about that process?
Right now, the IGA lists the period of operation of July 1 of this year through April 1st of 2024. We would like to extend the operational period until June 30th, 2024. There would be no more funding. We would not take on additional households. It would simply give us a longer amount of time to be working with the households once the Hugo closes on December 31st.
Okay, and so, but are we confident that there's going to be agreement?
I talked with Farah Bors, who's the ODHS director, and he thinks it shouldn't be a problem. He'll go with us to legislators to ask for the extension if it's needed.
Okay, great, great. And then, Mary, you mentioned the sole source exemption. Can you remind me who that exemption is for?
So we're asking for the exemption in order to be able to contract with nonprofit organizations that are aligned to the countries of origin, and then 3 other what I would call professional services agreements, one of which is for immigration attorneys for the issue, Commissioner Brim-Enders, that you were just speaking to. We just need more capacity to work with the households in order to get them moving on the immigration piece, so it's a domino effect. Also, community-based advocacy and organizing for these communities to be able to participate in the long-term planning discussions. And then lastly, an organization that will help with a third-party paying of the income and some database pieces. So we have a rationale. We've made that request based on what's allowable in the administrative rules. And that will, once we, if that is approved, then we will be able to go to contract.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you. Let's see if there's any other questions. I guess I don't really have any other questions. I mean, obviously, I really, we're going to have a conversation about housing and finding more places for people to live. And, so it's not lost on any of us that folks are going to need a place to live. And addressing future homelessness is a critical thing that we have to continue to do. I am concerned about when the program ends. Like, we're stepping in and we want to help these people, and you're right, it is part of our core mission, and I want to do that. However, I am worried about the communications. That something about no good deed goes unpunished, is that at the end of this program, I worry that we're going to be seen as the cause or the problem of this program ending, when we are not doing that. We are just simply trying to house people immediately, and I assume you're going to start housing people, like, you're not waiting until December 31st.
Oh, no. We the minute we are able to get resources, I mean, let's be clear, the nonprofit organizations are already working without compensation because these are their community. The minute we get resources out, people will start the day before placing folks with the resources.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your hard work.
Thank you all for this. I really appreciate all of the work that's gone into this, and there's definitely going to be further conversations with the legislatures legislators over the next several months with ODHS, but also, in preparation for the allocation to try to keep resources for that 1 year period. It makes a lot of sense, and hopefully we have some agreement with that with our folks down at the state. Just as a reminder to the board, this will be coming on Thursday for the budget modification. That's going to be. It should be relatively quick since we've had this briefing, but it's really for us to accept that state money and then be able to put it out into the use as quickly as possible. So thank you all so very much for that. We'll go ahead and move on to our second board briefing item, which will be the work session around the supportive housing service measure dollars. We're going to take a brief recess so we can move the chairs and move our stuff down there. So we will reconvene in just a few minutes. With that, we are in recess. I did turn. Wait, hold on. Can you hear me? No. Now? Yes? No? No. Okay, no. I can grab the mic that was up there. Testing? Testing, testing? No. Testing, testing? I can use my handheld.
I think this is on.
I'm on.
Hello?
There we are, back in business. As we do more and more of these, I think we are learning what technology we need to make these work more seamlessly, but that's good, it's learning. So I want to thank everyone for engaging this conversation today. I also wanted to thank folks from Metro who are here to talk about the investments with the Supportive Housing Surface Measure dollars. And this conversation today is to talk about the investments we're proposing as a board for the unanticipated Supportive Housing Service Measure dollars. So we're going to first hear a brief presentation from Metro, who is going to talk a little bit about, lay some groundwork on that. We'll have a time to ask them questions. Christian will come and run through the proposals that we have had so far, and then it will be time for the board to put forward any new proposals, and I have some that I want to share with the board, as well as then moving into the conversation about the investments overall. So with that, I'm so glad that we have Patricia Rojas and Josh Harwood here from Metro to talk about the Metro's specific calculations around unanticipated dollars. They're always, I think, as we're doing our budgeting and going through how we're planning best for these dollars, those unanticipated dollars, which are most often one time only, are kind of like an additional complication that we want to make sure that we're being planful and having this kind of discussion about that. So with that, I will turn things over. And Josh, I believe you're beginning. Thank you.
I think so. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Peterson. My name is Josh Harwood. I'm the Fiscal and Tax Policy Director at Metro. I'm just going to ground us a little bit in the taxes themselves, because I think that'll help inform a lot of the discussions around one-time, ongoing, those kinds of discussions, because these taxes are unique in the country, basically, and they're a little bit of a building a plane as we fly kind of operation in terms of figuring out sort of the tax base and the mechanisms or the hydraulics of the system itself. So if we can put up the slides, that would be great. So real quick, again, these are two taxes, and they're very distinct. The first tax is a business tax. It's very similar to your business tax at Multnomah County or the city's business tax. It taxes both C corporations and S corporations, limited liability companies. These corporations are basically known as pass-through entities. So it does capture them as well. It also has a personal income tax. That is an income tax that's similar to the Preschool for All tax that you have. It is based on $125,000 in income for single filers and $200,000 for joint filers. That is the exemption level, so we only tax income above those levels. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the volatility of these taxes, because it is a very important characteristic when we talk about sort of the unanticipated revenues or the changes in forecasts and those kinds of things. So SHS tax is amongst the most volatile income sources that we can possibly tax. So if we think about it from a tax perspective, income taxes are more volatile than sales taxes, and sales taxes are more volatile than property taxes. Within income taxes, corporate and business income taxes are more volatile than personal income taxes. And then within personal income taxes, those with higher incomes are more volatile than those with lower incomes. So we're going to, even in normal circumstances, regardless of what I forecast, we are going to see fluctuations in these revenues that are going to be significant. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to put this slide up and just take a minute here to explain it. So this is the change in income. The green bars are the change in total income for the Tri-County area. This is using state data. So the green bars are the change in total income. So that's what the state is basing their forecast on. Tomorrow they will come out with a September revenue forecast that will have, amongst the findings in it, will be the largest kicker in state history. Those green bars contributed to that, especially the green bar at the far right end. The blue bars are our taxes, for taxes people just above $250,000. So you can see they're about twice as volatile as even the state taxes that drove this record kicker. Next slide, please. Why is that the case? It is the case because their income profiles are different. So for people making less than $200,000, roughly 3/4 of their income is wages and salaries. For people making more than $500,000, less than 40% of their income is wages and salaries. So we are talking about highest income people that have multiple sources of income, that get documentation for those sources of income at different times of year, pay taxes at different times of year, and those kinds of things. So that just lends itself to the volatility that we see. Next slide, please. So what happened in 2021? We just got 2021 state tax data in June. Income taxes have a long lag as well. That is one characteristic of it. Property taxes come on an annual basis. We get it once a year. Sales taxes are a real-time tax. So we see receipts on a real-time basis. If we had a sales tax, we'd see it on a real-time basis. And so, but income taxes are collected in arrears. So we're looking at economic activity that happened 12 and 18 months prior. And we can see in 2021, even in the height of the pandemic, we saw a massive jump in incomes for those making more than $250,000. Overall, for the Tri-County area, the total number of tax returns actually fell. It fell slightly from 2020 to 2021, but the incomes jumped by 30%. And incomes for the highest income group jumped even more. Next slide, please. For the business taxes, this is my last slide, and then we can talk about this is my second to last slide. But for businesses, the thing to know about the tax is that, and Jeff Renfro has talked about this at length with you, it's a very high concentrated tax. So the very few number of companies pay an exorbitant amount of the taxes relative to the other people. So when we look at businesses, about 4% of businesses paid about 60% of our taxes for business taxes last year. So only about 250 taxpayers made up almost 2/3 of our taxes for business taxes. And so when we're talking about forecasts, we're talking about very few number of decision makers that are actually driving a lot of our income and our revenues. One more slide, please. And finally, this is just a look at sort of the relative volatility of all the taxes that the city of Portland collects. And the top four are all business taxes. So that has the Portland business tax, the clean energy surcharge tax, that's a gross receipts tax. It's slightly different, but in the same vein. And the Multnomah County business tax, and then the Metro business tax. And you can see the big jump in business taxes for Metro taxes. That's for two reasons. One is from spillover from the prior year, but another is not every business has the same fiscal year. So for some businesses, they didn't pay at all the first year of the taxes, but the second year they started to pay it because of the timing of when their tax years were. And then the bottom part is personal taxes, and we can see Portland Arts tax actually fell a little bit. That's essentially a head tax, so that just tells you a little bit about the underlying demographics and population that's been in the news a lot lately. And then the preschool for all tax jumped somewhat, and then our personal tax also jumped quite a bit, and that's mostly due to spillover from the prior fiscal year. So one more slide, please, and I'll wrap it up for you. But as we move forward, what we're going to do is try and come to you with a 5-year forecast in November that will describe the ongoing and one time. The challenge we're having right now is that the tax base is still growing from 2021. We're still collecting some revenue from 2021. When those taxes are collected from people in 2021, likely they are paying 2021, 2022, and 2023 taxes all in this fiscal year. So we will see, one year we will see this spike, and then we'll get to normalization somewhat lower. But that tax base is larger than we thought. And that's one thing we learned in June we intuited that it was likely that was the case. We got confirmation in June from the state. And so that is why we're partly here today, and why we'll be here probably, or not necessarily here, but you will hear from us around this time of year every year, because that's when we get the information to help inform these forecasts and these taxes. And then we'll do a 5-year forecast per the IGA in November, where we'll come to your finance folks and lay out sort of a more comprehensive look at the 5-year forecast and where we think things are headed.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. We'll go to see if folks have questions. Do you have any specific information about what you're expecting us to see in, we're dealing with unanticipated now. Do you have a crystal ball for what we might expect to see?
Yes, I did. We did send over to your finance staff, to the finance staff for all 3 counties yesterday, an anticipation of FY24 revenues of about $320 million in total, which is an increase in your revenue base of about $40 million. It's a little less than that, but it's about $40 million that we're relatively certain we will see in this fiscal year. That's still a forecast. It's still subject to change, but I think that we reasonably can say now that the tax base is significantly bigger, and we're still collecting from 2021 in a way that led us to believe that we will get at least that amount.
Okay, so just so the board is clear on that. So what they're saying is, we had an estimated revenue of what we would get from the Supportive Housing Service measure dollars for FY24. We used that to put together the budget that we passed in June. Most of us passed in June. And now they're saying that they're anticipating about $40 million in addition to that Multnomah County would receive. And then my understanding of those dollars is that those are, again, because people's fiscal years are different for businesses, that money would actually come in towards the latter part of the year. Is that?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I should have probably specified that. The cycle for most of our revenues mean that basically we collect most of our revenues towards the end of the fiscal year. And so it's a typical income tax cycle, like all of us hopefully pay income taxes on a regular cycle. And so we collect most of the money in April and May, but we are collecting more in estimated payments and withholdings along the way every month. So we're getting a clearer picture about what the size of that tax base is and what it looks like.
Okay.
If I can add, Patricia Rojas, she, her pronouns, Housing Director for Metro. Thank you for having us. I think that it's helpful to kind of differentiate, like when we talk about unanticipated collections, so those are actual revenues that have been collected and dispersed to the county. So all FY23 collections, which we had unanticipated collections, have been dispersed. What we're doing now is updating the forecast for 24, and we'll do this every year. So post collections year end, then we have a process to update figures based on what we actually collected. So that's what we're sharing now. And then come November, we will provide the 5-year forecast, and that will help you do your budget for next year. So there's a rhythm here. I think that the challenge in terms of cash flow is that most of the money comes in Q4. And so that will be true every year. And so I think it's helpful to understand the unanticipated piece, which is already cash in hand, versus an adjusted forecast that we expect to come in for FY24. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And I think it's also helpful as we think about when this money actually comes in and where we are in our planning processes for either the current fiscal year or anticipating next year. When we're talking about May, that's right when we're in the middle of our budget conversation for the next year. So I think that's a conversation that we need to continue to have with you, Metro, in terms of how we're going to actually be planning for these dollars and where we're actually going to be seeing it put to use. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'm going to open it up to the board now for comments. So go ahead.
Just a clarifying question on that. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's $40 million that we're talking about now that is unanticipated forecasted for FY24.
Adjusted
correct?
Forecast.
Okay. And there is, and I'm now blanking on what the unanticipated for 23 was. So there is the unanticipated for 23 that we had already started discussing. And how much was that?
It was upwards of 50 million.
Okay, so 50 million of unanticipated for 23, 40 million of unanticipated forecasted for +24, and of that bucket, some may be, again, one time only, and some may be ongoing.
Yes.
We'll know more when we do the 5-year forecast. I think that is a great question, and having more information about the 5-year outlook will be helpful to answering that kind of what is ongoing versus what is really one time.
Okay.
Yeah, for informational purposes, so what happens in April for most of our high-end taxpayers is they simply pay an extension. So they simply send in a check with the basic information that says, hey, I know I owe you something, here's what we think we owe you, here's an estimate. And then in October, they true that up. So we'll get more information in a month and a half that will help inform that. That's only the second year that we're going to get this information. So we're still, I know it feels like it's a long run. It is. It's a long ramp up to get the information, but that's how it flows.
There we go. Just to follow on that. So, because most of it is not income it's not salary, but it's other income. They say you file the extension in April, you have till October to pay it. You pay what you think you owe, but also at that point in time, now people know that the tax exists, which was one of the initial issues. Do they also have a requirement, just like with your federal taxes, that you have to pay quarterly payments, and which would be different than just coming out of your paycheck? Because when it comes out of your paycheck, it just comes out of your paycheck. But if you have non-salaried income, you have to then do quarterly payments. Does does Metro have that same requirement of quarterly payments?
Yes, we do. It's exactly the same.
So at a certain point, we'll have a pretty good sense, except for people who are newly upper income.
You've got it, exactly.
Or have one-time resources coming in. Thank you for explaining that. So we should have, at a certain point in time, a lot more regularity and our predictability in how it comes in.
Yes, Commissioner.
One of the things that stood out for me in the presentation, you said, there's not a page number on it, but it's the page about the total state returns went down slightly, and also the number of returns fell in Multnomah County or metro area.
Mm-hmm.
How much did they fall by?
Just by a little bit. I think in Multnomah County it's about 2%, and tri-county wide it's I think a little over 1%, but I don't know. It's a very small number. It flattened out and went down a little bit, but there's a lot going on in those 2021 numbers because of the pandemic. So I don't want to say that's a trend or anything quite yet.
Yeah, well, I guess the reason why I'm also interested in that is because then the next page where you have really an over-reliance on a very narrow base of business taxpayers, only 246. And so if you look at, you have 11 that are over $1 million. So if not very many businesses leave, you actually could lose, we could lose a pretty significant sum of money. And I think it's worth tracking that, because you could get a lot of volatility because there's not very, 10 businesses leaving is a lot more than 10 businesses of 246 is a lot more than 10 of 5,000.
Yeah, can I respond real quick,
Yeah,
Commissioner?
please.
Real quick.
I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
I think no, that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we are overly concerned about a very small number of taxpayers. That's absolutely the case. For businesses, though, their tax is based on sales into an area, so if they pick up and move, per se, we don't have the same kind of impacts. We will see that on the personal side, though. The personal side, absolutely, we're going to track that. We're tracking the number of returns. We're tracking where they're going as much as we can. Again, this information is in arrears, so it's coming slowly, but we are tracking the information. The forecast in November will contemplate sort of a secular decline in what that looks like, because I think we need to. I don't think that we're going to see massive people move out of the county or anything like that. But I do think it's reasonable to think that people moving in might choose a different place to live.
And just the last question about this. So if a business, it's all sales, it's the sales piece of it, are those primarily retail, or is it service or business to business? Because it's harder just to pick up retail sales and leave, but it's pretty easy to pick up other like business-to-business sales and move somewhere else.
Absolutely. We're definitely, I mean, the information that's coming out of downtown around office space is real, and it's really important that we keep track of that. So we're absolutely looking at that. We always keep track of business and job activity in the area. That's part of the job. That's part of what we track. So yes, I mean, it's hard right now to tease out what is a trend and what is a pandemic impact still. And so we're trying to, because we're working with data that's still a couple years old. So as we get more and more information, I'm happy to come back and I'm happy to share as information as we get it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, over the long haul, we're definitely going to have to be looking at what the potential looks like for a very small number of people, but that owe us a lot of money right now in our taxes. Those decision makers are going to have an outsized impact in our revenue streams.
Thank you. I'll be interested in tracking that because there's a lot of conversation in the business community about that, especially if you're not dependent upon sales here, but you have a presence here. You're not dependent on retail sales because then you could actually do your work anywhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh and Patricia. Thank you for being here. So I was just curious. So you're saying that the tax years 21, 22, and 23. Like, why wouldn't have people paid like 21 and 22, or like I don't understand. Like, why did they wait 3 years?
Well, the city is part of the city's administration of the tax program is enforcement actions, and they have a variety of ways in which they get information that suggests that people might owe money to our taxes. And so they are going through that process of capturing people that either didn't know, didn't pay, maybe aren't even a resident but have earned income here. They own 5 rental homes or something along those lines or something. And so those people are getting letters now. And for those people that have consistent incomes, they will owe taxes for those successive years all at once. And so we'll see the revenue all in 1 year, but then the next year we'll just get 1 year's worth of revenue. And so that's one thing we need to watch for dynamics in terms of the tax collections.
Do we know what the percentage? Do we know, have most people paid it? Isn't it just a small percentage?
We believe we believe nearly all of them have paid, but we don't know exactly the number because some of these letters that are going out to people are like, you may owe us taxes based on information we have, and so we don't know the size of it. So we have some estimates about what we think we're going to get in terms of audit recoveries and those kinds of things, but to the extent that we get a lot more, it'll just magnify that variance from the forecast that much more because we'll collect from successive years just one time.
Okay, and can you talk about how late fees and interests are in your calculations? I assume they are.
Yeah, they are embedded in the calculations, but they're not very significant. So when we're talking about, all taxes, all penalties and interest were waived for 2021. So for 2022, we're only 5 months past the due date. So even then, we're only talking about a percentage of a penalty. It's very small right now still. It's only like 5% of what they owe. So it's a relatively de minimis amount. That's the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to be clear. So today's conversation is, because wasn't this originally like 46 million, but now the updated number is 40 million? Is that?
No, so 40 million, we don't have to worry about that yet. I just want to,
Okay.
so what we're talking about today is around the $50 million that we have in unanticipated FY23 dollars.
Okay, okay.
That 40 million is unanticipated, or updated forecast for FY24.
Okay,
So,
all right, thank you.
Thanks.
and we'll, as I said, we'll have a further discussion in November about that whole outlook. Okay, any other questions? Because I really appreciate Metro being here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you. I appreciate your being here as well. It's good to see you. And I just want to highlight my agreement with Commissioner Brim Edwards' comment about really focusing and understanding that dynamic with some of our businesses who do have an outsized impact on the revenue we get from the SHS measure, and strategies to talk to them, to work with them, to ensure that there's not the kind of volatility or that they're not leaving the county, things we can do to make make things as sustainable and stable as possible for them and for this funding source. And I also want to say we have the 50 of unanticipated revenue, then we have the 40 of unanticipated other revenue. You know, I know we say a lot that we need more money, and I'm going to put out right now, I think we need to use the money that we do have wisely to accomplish meaningful goals that are big goals, and maybe take this opportunity to think outside the box, do things differently, innovatively, and just leading into the CAP conversation. This is a ton of money. I do not believe we need more until we prove we use what we have wisely. Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here today. We'll look forward to having you guys come back in November, the latest probably, to continue this conversation. But thank you for spending time with us as we're having this conversation. Really appreciate it. I'm going to now invite Christian Elkin from our budget department to come down to walk us through the proposals that they've been so far, just to help kind of ground us as we continue the conversation around potential uses for these unanticipated revenues for FY23. Welcome, Christian.
Chair, can I ask a question? I thought last week when the meeting got cut off sort of at the end of the meeting that we were going to have a continuation of today of the
CAP proposals?
the unspent dollars versus unanticipated, because that is how we sort of ended the meeting, that we'd have time this next week. So so are we having that here now as well? Because I'm not seeing it also on Thursday's meeting calendar. And I also have submitted a whole host of questions that I didn't obviously get to ask the other day, which I would like to have answers for before this. I'm concerned that it was laid out that we're going to have a vote on September 7th. And if we aren't actually going to have a further discussion, because there was no discussion really at the last meeting, and we also didn't have a chance to ask questions. I submitted some and asked some, but I don't have any questions. And I want to make sure that I'm just at the beginning of this meeting putting in place a sort of marker down that that's going to be a requirement for me to be able to be supportive. Or frankly, I feel like because we didn't have an opportunity, that there needs to be space for that we have that, and staff needs to answer the questions that any board members have.
Yeah, that we can have that conversation. This is just to lay the groundwork for, or the proposals are there for the unanticipated revenue. We added 30 minutes to this conversation today so we can have a time for a robust conversation around both the unanticipated revenue and the underspending. And I know that there was, a desire on the board to have those conversations together. Okay. All right. I don't know I don't know who you sent those questions for. Okay.
And I also asked them in the meeting.
Okay.
So, and I've sent them twice.
Okay. So we have the director of the Joint Office here, so we can have we can get an update on where those answers are for you in a minute. But we'll go ahead and invite Christian up to walk through where we are, and then this is like the latest and greatest spreadsheet. I know there have been lots of updates happening on this, so.
Good morning, everyone. Christian Elkin, County Budget Director. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for your patience with me. Usually I'm really good at spreadsheets, and somehow I just kept missing things. We had a little medical emergency with my son and a bee yesterday, so I think I was just a little out of it, so I apologize. So I think I've captured everybody's ideas here on, and I just want to walk everyone through the spreadsheet. As you all know, there's also a second tab in this with detailed information from the proposals that were shared from all the commissioners and the chair. But I'd like to just walk through the spreadsheet and then just highlight some areas as we go through these conversations that I think we'll need to continue to work together to make sure that we have a really robust understanding of the proposals that are on the table, both the short-term and the long-term impacts and what we're trying to accomplish. First, I want to identify that these proposals are not in priority order. They are in the order that they came in my email inbox. At some point, we'll probably want to think about how we think about structuring this as priorities as we think about how to spend this funding. The 24 column, so that is the fourth column, or the third column over, is the amount identified by the commissioners as needed to put towards this investment to achieve the outcomes. The fourth column, the 24 one-time only or ongoing, is really meant to identify what the current proposal on the table is, whether or not that's a one-time only expense or ongoing. A lot of the proposals that you all put forward are capital. That's why we have the capital column at the end. Those I categorized as one-time only. If I have miscategorized something, please just let me know and I will update that. I tried to share this as broadly as possible to make sure that we were getting consensus, and I did, of course, miss a few things that were miscategorized. So the program title is here to help identify what the investment is going towards. Like I said, the whole program description is on that second tab in your Google Sheets. Outcomes, we still need to do some work around some of the proposals to ensure that we are communicating what the achievements of these investments are going to make. So I think there's some work to do there. Tried to identify if we're going to need additional county staff to help manage some of the programs. Again, some of those are probably need some fill in the blanks by people who are smarter than I am. And then we have the two gray columns, and this is where we really need to step back and do some work around. We are making some significant investments of one-time only dollars. As you heard from Josh this morning, there is the possibility as we go into 24 that the forecast gets adjusted to identify some of that as ongoing. We also want to make sure that we're being really intentional about the one-time only dollars that we're spending, and if they are creating a need for ongoing spending, I think we just want to be really upfront about that and what that could be. What you see in this, in the column that's FY25 estimated ongoing costs, in the spreadsheets, I went through and got some kind of average costs for congregate shelter, motel shelter, alternative shelter, these types of things based on what we currently fund in the joint office, and then just extrapolated that out based on if we're buying 100 beds or we're starting up an alternative shelter, kind of so we could all start to get a sense of what those ongoing costs are. Those ongoing costs might be partnerships with other partners, and we just need to identify that, you know, somebody else is going to be paying for these ongoing costs, but where appropriate, I want to make sure that we're being pretty honest with ourselves about the commitments that we're making going into fiscal year 2025. So that's kind of the spreadsheet there. Like I said, there's still some work to be done as we move through these proposals, but having it in one place I think is helpful. I would like to highlight we are at 100, I need reading glasses now and I keep not acknowledging that. So we're at $192 million in proposals. Right now, what we have on the table is about between $50 and $51 million of revenue that was unanticipated in fiscal year 2023 that truly is one-time only that's coming to the county. Yeah, that's all the proposals together, yes. Some might be duplicative, that is true. Oh, thank you.
Any questions for Christian? Okay.
Just clarification, if we have sort of corrections, or not corrections, but like adjustments of like, this was entirely supposed to be a capital spend versus like an ongoing piece, should we just provide that to you and then there'll be an updated version?
Absolutely, and the I put everybody, I wanted to be able to, you know, in Google, if I move everybody to commenters, then it kind of locks the spreadsheet for a moment to make sure that we understand what the adjustments that are being made. So I can work with your chiefs of staff to make those adjustments, but I would like to try to keep version control because it can get a little out of hand, especially when you have a spreadsheet that's kind of floating around. I want to make sure you all understand the trajectory and the changes that are being made as we go forward.
Love this. This is great.
Yeah, it's similar to what we do when we consider all the board amendments for the budgets process. So we're just kind of modeling this whole thing on that. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Christian, for putting all this together and keeping this a living document. Commissioner Brim-Edwards, I did find out that staff met with your staff yesterday to go through some of your questions, and they'll follow up with you later today to make sure that they have a chance to talk with you about them.
I'd like written answers to my questions, but I'd like them. Can you just send me the answer? Can you just send me the answers in real time, and I'll look at it in my email?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
So that it's not after the meeting, because actually it informs the meeting, and I say I asked for them several times, so.
Sure, we will make sure you get those. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that we have the conversation now about the most recent proposal that I'm bringing forward, and then we can talk about these investments. We can talk about the CAP investments. We will open it up for the discussion for this last part of our work session here. So I appreciate Metro being here. I appreciate Christian really doing some of the level setting around the dollars that we're talking about for unanticipated revenue. We're continuing the conversation. That's going to be an ongoing public conversation around our decisions around these dollars, including just in for the overall investments for the housing and houselessness services that we need. Again, a lot of the conversation is around dollars, right? It's around, unspent dollars, unanticipated dollars. We talk a lot about the dollars, but the investments aren't about the dollars, right? The investments are about getting the results for our community, the people who are living unsheltered, the community at large really expect and deserve, especially for those of us who are living and most deeply affected by the crisis that's going on. For those people who are living without a home right now, not having a bed, not having a place to call home, these are very real. This is the reality that they're living with. And so, as we're thinking about this, and I know this is shared, I've heard other folks say it at the board, there's no one in our community who isn't feeling the impact of homelessness on our streets. It's in every neighborhood. It's a part of our daily lives. And so I know that each of you carry that weight for not just for your districts, but you hear most intensely what's happening in your own districts around this issue, but as the county as a whole. And so that's really, the spirit I think we're approaching these as we're putting together these proposals is really about how do we increase our response in a way that is most effective and impactful for the crisis that we're seeing on our streets. The budgetary specifics around these dollars are changing. We're getting more things. I want to have this open dialogue so that we are best prepared to have that conversation. Right now, we're treating all of these as one-time investments. I think we will hear in November what the forecast might look like in terms of ongoing dollars, but we need to consider how we're going to be using these resources today for the short term, but also for the long term. And we need to have this, this is going to be an ongoing conversation that we have at the Joint Office, not just in November, but as we're looking at the FY25 budget and what that means for there. So the investments that I'm putting forward are not only, I think, I looked at it from the perspective of what can we do that's immediately responsive to the crisis, but also a continuation and a shoring up of the work that's currently underway at the Joint Office for our provider network and the continuum of services that these supports. And I really tried to look at it in terms of the 5 different categories that the Joint Office uses as they make their investments, and we see this as a through line, like as they bring things forward for the budget, for shelter bed expansion, increased access to daytime services, housing placement, housing retention, and eviction prevention, income development and employment services, and capital investment and acquisition. And the investments that I'm proposing were developed using the more strategic ways. I view the work of the county in this critical moment. So as I was, coming into this position and on the campaign trail, one of the promises was not only to increase the amount of shelter available to the community, but to improve the efficiency of our system, to improve the way that our system works in terms of flow through our system of getting people moved into permanent housing. The more that we are able to improve how well our shelters operate, especially in terms of moving people through them and into housing services more quickly and efficiently, the better that we are going to be able to get upstream about the lack of beds that we have available. So it's a both and, right? It is increasing the number of shelter beds, increasing the number of available beds, and also moving through the people through the system of our shelter more efficiently so we have better turnover and better capacity. So one of the proposals that I have is supporting the specific work of managing every type of shelter that we have more efficiently and effectively. I think that it's really incumbent upon us to think through how our entire county can be more thoughtfully considered in the larger plans that we're making too. So how can we engage everyone in the county in this work that we're doing, and where are we not living up to that? And I also would love to see, as a couple of you on the board have talked about, more resources for the long-term rental assistance. How, as we're moving people into shelter, moving people into housing, how can we make sure that they are going to be successful in those housing situations long term? So we need to increase the stability of people who are living in very vulnerable, precarious situations. And the design is ongoing, flexible, and continued rental subsidies are available to many in this county who have extreme and prolonged low incomes. We need to have that stability. And again, this is for how do we use these unanticipated dollars to really set people up for that long-term stability in the best way possible, knowing that at this point they are one-time only dollars. So these and the other investments that I'm proposing are designed to integrate and amplify the work that is already starting in the Joint Office using the Supportive Housing Services Measure funds that we're now able to consider in a holistic and sustainable way. I want to talk a little bit, though, about how I approached these proposals in terms of both success metrics and outcomes. Everything that we consider investing in, we need to make sure what exactly that's going to look like on the far end. So in addition to specific investments, I propose that we really work with the Joint Office to have global protocols that we consider as we're making these decisions around what we're funding and how we're moving them forward. What I would like to see is every proposal that we adopt and fund our work together, ultimately when we're voting on them, include data requirements for assessing the work, proposed outcomes and how these investments support the overarching goals of the Supportive Housing Service Measure and our local implementation plan, and the long-term metrics of success. And so this is something that I've asked the Joint Office to assist the board in putting those together, so we really feel that there is a robust and full picture of not just the dollars that are being spent, but what we're looking to see from those dollars. I think that it's important, as we're asking for more accountability and transparency from our providers, from the Joint Office, from the work that we're doing, that we're holding ourselves to that same standard. So that was kind of the preface for this. I wanted to talk about the proposals that I have. So the first one, and everybody should have had received the investments last night. But the first one is really around that shelter flow through, right? We want to make sure that we have the right systems in place to help facilitate the working of our system in a really efficient way. So in the first 3 quarters of FY23, there were more than 5,500 people that accessed a shelter bed through the Joint Office. Some of those households exited and returned to permanent housing. Others remain in shelter. Others transitioned to other stable options. Some people returned to the street or just never returned, and we've lost track of them. Those are not good. We need to know exactly what's happening with folks. We also know that we have a variety of services that people have access to depending on what shelter they're in. That is something that I want to see change too. I think that we need to make sure that everyone who is accessing our shelter system has some basic services that they are having, so that they can be connected to the help that they need, whether it's getting an ID, whether it's getting onto OHP, whether it's transitioning into the services they need to get into housing. So across our range, whether it's congregate, alternative shelter, whether we're talking about the city's programs, making sure that we have on-site peer support services, behavioral health supports, lower staff to participant ratios, income development, employment assistance, flexible and long-term rental assistance, and the resources to help people stay successfully in housing once they leave the shelter. That is part of the investment that I have. And so I'm proposing $11 million to help with that shelter flow-through work, as well as the services around the shelters that are in our system now. The second proposal I have is around an East County housing and homelessness liaison. I think I know that in my conversations, a lot of the discussion seems to assume that like the work of the Joint Office and the work of the City of Portland are exactly the same conversation. But we are a county wide response system for homelessness services, and I know that there are issues, there are concerns that our East County folks have that are not always elevated or not always get the attention that I think they need. So I want to invest the joint office to make sure that there is a better overall coordination for Outer East Portland and East Multnomah County services. So this would be an FTE position for the joint office. I know that as we're looking at the work of the joint office, having somebody who's specifically responsible for what's happening in East County, I think will be helpful for both the conversation and the relationships we're having with our East County partners, but also like creating that plan for the work that's happening with East County. The third is the Regional Long-Term Rental Assistance Vouchers, ARLA, as we've talked about today. This is really around having the flexible and continued resources for people to help them stay successful in housing, especially folks who are the most vulnerable. Tenant-based ARLA subsidies are going to leverage existing private market and regulated housing. We want to make sure that we're maximizing tenant choice, and we want to also be supporting the project-based regional long-term rental assistance that are going to help take advantage of the new housing units that we have in development. We want to have, I want to propose that this is used to help with move-in costs, with supportive services, and with that long-term rental assistance. So really, again, all of the things that are necessary to have people be successful in housing. This includes a regional landlord guarantee to cover potential damages, to increase participation, and to mitigate the risks for participating landlords. I think that's something that we've seen in other locations is a key to successful programs like this. We want to make sure that participating units are going to meet inspection requirements and rent reasonableness standards so that base rents do not exceed 120% of the fair market rental that is established by HUD for our region. So in looking at the outcomes for this, it's about the regional long-term rental assistance vouchers that are committed, how many of those are actually being used, so not just allocating them, but making sure they're getting out and used, and what is the percentage of housing retention at 12 months post-payment, so making sure that people are truly staying successfully housed for longer term, and that I'm proposing $6 million for that. There are also a few smaller, some of these are aligned with other proposals that have been made by the board. So one of the things that we saw in the most recent point in time count is that children experiencing homelessness has actually increased year over year. And so for me, how we are responding and how we are investing in our family system is a really important consideration. It's something that I'm going to be looking at in anticipation of the next year's budget as well. But I wanted to propose expanding shelter beds and housing assistance for homeless families using these dollars. So there's $75,000 for that. And then I think Commissioner Jayapal and others have brought forward the LGBTQ plus eviction prevention and housing services. We've had people come and testify for that. So I'm proposing to use the $2.3 million for those and really looking at the outcomes around that being development of a trans and queer supportive housing service center, looking at the number of housing placements, looking at the number of evictions prevented, and again, seeing how successfully people are staying housed at the 12-month interval. And then finally, I know this has been talked about, the employment services. A part of the CAP proposal was $1.5 million for the Clean Start program. I also want to allocate $500,000 for East County employment service expansions of really looking at the work that is happening and the really necessary work that's happening in East County for taking people experiencing homelessness and giving them employment opportunities, as well as addressing some of the needs around livability for our East County. So the outcome will be the number of people served and the number of people finding post-internship stable employment, and that's for $500,000. So in looking at all of these, really trying to fit those into the 5 different categories and talking about that. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was it's not a part of the proposals that I have for this unanticipated income, but it's something that I would like to see the board take action on more more quickly and urgently is a proposal for the Bybee Lakes, the Helping Hands proposal. So I've had individual conversations with you, but I wanted to bring this forward to the board. So there's an urgent need for investment for Bybee Lakes to make sure that they can keep their doors open and serve the people that they need to. And I know all of you say this, I do not want us to lose a single shelter bed. We really can't afford to in the situation that we're now in. So there is a proposal that we shared with them to help cover 75% of their operating dollars through the end of the calendar year at $808,000. This would also, and this is money that I would like us to be able to deliver to them as soon as possible to get that money out. That is dollars that can come from some things that we've set aside in contingency right now. So we have some contingency dollars that were set aside through allocation that Commissioner Jayapal had in anticipation of a potential use for some of the services that we deliver to people who are behind on their property taxes and maybe losing their home. Those are the type of services that we can backfill with supportive housing service measure dollars, but the money is there available if we wanted to move quickly on getting money into Bybee Lakes. I will say this doesn't preclude any future investment by the board for Bybee Lakes. It is, but what I would like to see us be able to move more quickly to get this money out. There are a couple of, I think, contingencies for Bybee Lakes to consider with this proposal. One is that there is an ask for them to meet regularly with our finance folks around at the county around they're doing, and having a third party come in to do an assessment of their financial and operational picture and have a report back to the board by December 31st of this year so that we have a chance to see where they are financially, what are recommendations that would be included in the report for the long-term sustainability of their programs, and really I think set us up in a better position for long-term investment with them as a partner, knowing where they are financially, what are some good strategies for long-term. So that is something that I want to put forward, because if that is something that we're going to, I want to have a conversation about that, but I want to make sure that we, and I know, like I said, I know I've talked to you privately, but wanted to bring it out into this forum because if this is something that we want to move forward on, then we will need to do that on Thursday of this week to move forward. And as I said, it doesn't preclude any of the other proposals or investments that people have. That's still open for conversation, but I think this gives us both a way to move forward with an investment in a partner who's in a critical situation and sets us up for a greater opportunity for long-term partnership, knowing what the situation is. So those were my things that I wanted to share, and now I'll open it up for the conversation. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also happy to have this conversation go wherever we want it to.
If I could jump in real quick, because I want to make one clarification / question about the Bybee Lakes proposal. The money that, as I recall, the money that I advocated to set aside in contingency was for the fact that we were using proceeds from tax foreclosures to support severe weather shelter. And so when we learned about the Supreme Court decision that might reduce the amount of tax foreclosure proceeds we got, we set aside money in contingency, as I understood it, for the severe weather shelter. Not to say that I wouldn't support moving it, but just to be clear, that was what I understood the contingency to be. Let's just wrap up that question and then we can have the bigger conversation.
Commissioner, that's correct. So we had $1.5 million in the joint office that was funded through the tax title program. It served a range from families to youth to severe weather shelters. And we knew that going into this process, we got that late-breaking news with the Supreme Court, and so we wanted to make sure that we had an offset to reduce and mitigate that risk through the contingency. What I proposed to the chair was that we could use that contingency now if the board elected to support Bybee Lakes, and then what we would need to do is then in the proposals that go forth for the SHS, identify that amount and make sure that it gets on the list to be funded so that we ensure that we have that capacity, whether it's through general fund contingency or through the SHS unanticipated.
Right. I just wanted to be clear that it was severe weather shelter, because that, given what we're facing in terms of severe weather, that seemed like a place where we needed to make sure that we were protected. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay,
And it's
great.
across all the
Yeah.
populations, which shows up differently depending on the population that we're serving, how we do that work.
Can I? Oh,
I had a question, and this goes back to, and just for the record, I didn't get answers to my very specific questions, and it's really relevant for today's conversation. For example, I think it's great that you've put money on the table for East County cleanup, but one of the questions I had for staff is like, what is the $1.5 million? What areas would that be focused on? And I spent yesterday all over Southeast Portland, Foster, 82nd, 92nd, Holgate, Powell Division. There's trash everywhere. And one of the questions I asked was, where is this going to be designated? And the fact that I don't have a question, so it's like, should I be putting something specifically for Southeast Portland or the other like very specific corridors? And I want to note that I did not get answers to most of my questions, and it having an impact on what I actually can propose here, because Southeast Portland is very burdened by many of, as you know, because I know you live in Southeast, is very burdened by many of the challenges facing this community. I mean, there's still encampments all over the place, right next to schools. There's trash, there's graffiti, there's vandalism. But like, I would like to be able to put something forward, and that's why I asked the question, and I'd like to know where those other places are going to be designated so that I could put something on the table. And so I would just respectfully ask and clarify that I haven't gotten answers to my questions. Because I also have some questions about just the sort of the outcomes and what because if we're going to be making additional investments, like what are the specific outcomes and how does the rent assistance work? Because it looks like half the money doesn't actually go to rent assistance. And I think those are questions that we need to be, the answers we need to have in order to be able to have actually a transparent conversation about accountability and outcomes.
And I would just point out, we now have, we have like less than 20 minutes to have what was supposed to be, it was like, an hour and a half work session, but most of it was presentations, and then it was talking about things that are even outside maybe of this conversation, and we're left with 19 minutes for all of us to talk about these things, and that's sort of belies the purpose of having a work session.
So again, these aren't one-time only things, and frankly, like a lot of it was taken up by me giving mine, which is a part of the conversation, is making sure that you have a chance to hear about my proposal. So that was probably a good 10 minutes, and I apologize for taking up that time, but I actually don't apologize for taking up that time, because I think that is part of our conversation, is hearing everybody's proposals. And I wanted to make sure that the last time we did one of these, that all of you had the opportunity to deliver your proposals, which you did, and now I'm taking up the time to share my proposals so we can have that conversation. So if you have something that you want to share, like further proposals or further information, let's use that time for doing that now.
I have just a follow-up question to Bybee Lakes, just to close that loop. What has been his response to your proposal?
So I think there are some changes in leadership that are happening at Bybee Lakes. So we have been mainly working with some of their board members, and those are the folks that have been engaging in conversation, and really those are the folks that have been engaging with us. Betsy Johnson, Jerry from the board have been really engaged in the conversation and in terms of the proposals, in terms of the response. So we've been having very frequent conversations with them.
And they are in agreement with this proposal?
So we have had, and as I have mentioned before, so this is the proposal that we're putting forward. We're having conversations with them like on a daily basis, I would say, around this proposal. But again, I wanted to bring it publicly to you so everybody was aware of this. And we had some agreement last week that this was something that was acceptable for them. And then I think there was some hesitancy on the board. So but I've been hearing some very positive things about where they are with this, knowing that this is really opening a door for further partnership with them.
Thank you. I would like to just mention, and I'll try to keep it brief since there's so little time, but the fact that, again, I think a lot of what is being proposed, there's some overlap, which is great, and we alluded to that at our last work session, and I think we should figure out where those duplications are, where there's that overlap, so we can hone the conversation. So that I'm not saying we need a sobering center, and Commissioner Stegman and we're all saying we need a sobering center, and so sort of to find that consistency so we can move that forward. I personally think that we should not be focusing on sort of the general elements of what the whole role of the Joint Office for Homeless Services is. I think that we often fall into the trap of, and I think we've done this with the supportive housing services measure, frankly, too much, of basically just diffusing it and scattering it about so that it has a tiny little bit of impact on a whole range of things. And I posit that we need to have a big impact on some linchpin items that we will know need to be done in whatever our system ends up being. Although I've said it before, we don't have a plan. But whatever the plan is, we know, I believe sobering center is important. We absolutely need to expand shelter capacity meaningfully, not in one-offs and by small amounts. And we need the recovery-based supportive transitional housing, so when people are coming out of our detox centers or Unity or wherever, they have that place to go with job training and services to support them in recovery.
I'm going to build on that in one sense, which is that I do think we need to take a step back from this list of proposals. I think it's been useful and good for us to put our ideas out there and to see where the areas of overlap are. But the next step needs to be a synthesizing, and I would start even a step back from that. I think we need some agreement on guiding principles for how we're going to spend these resources. I introduced some of mine when I introduced my proposals, and I'll kind of refine them. And, we may not reach agreement on the ones that I come forward with, but that's where we need to start. And I would suggest that it's the Joint Office's role to listen to what we have to say about guiding principles, and then to articulate those guiding principles, and then to apply them to the various proposals that have been put out or to other ideas that the Joint Office might have. So that, I think we could go back and forth for a very long time with everybody arguing for their specific idea, and we'll end up with a little bit what Commissioner Myron is describing as sort of a grab bag of things that are all probably positive, but don't cohere into something that fits within a framework and that sort of allocates these resources to some extent across the spectrum, but also recognizing that this funding is a very specific kind of funding. So, with that preamble, I'll come back to what my guiding principles have been, and they've evolved, and I want to credit actually Washington County. Washington and Clackamas and Multnomah presented to the SHS Measure Oversight Committee yesterday, and some of the guiding principles that Washington County articulated made a lot of sense to me and helped to understand their buckets of proposals. So I think we could kind of, I just want to credit them for that. I've modified mine based on what I heard. So for me, the guiding principles are that the investment should align with the LIP. Now, I want to acknowledge Commissioner Myron's criticism that that is not an overall plan. I agree. It was a very specific spending plan for the revenue from a particular measure. It was not an overall strategic plan. I think at the time there was intent to create one, and then of course we had a pandemic and various other that's just an explanation, I think, for what that particular plan is. It is the guiding document. It reflects the principles that were articulated in the measure. It reflects the consensus at the time of the folks who voted for the measure. And I think that whatever we do has to comply with it. Now, it's pretty broad. I don't know that it, it has room for many of the things we're talking about, but I do think we still have to refer back to that and make sure that we're complying with it. It does need to be updated. It was created 3 years ago. It was created when homelessness looked different and was different. It was created before we truly understood what the revenues were going to be, which is what we heard from Metro today. And the goals that we articulated in that, it turns out we're actually really close to achieving many of the goals that were articulated in the LIP. And what that says is we need to be more ambitious. So it has to be updated, but I think we need to comply or be aligned with what's in that plan. The investments also need to be either fairly short-term or one-time only. Now, we heard that we may have more ongoing resources. So, I think the budget office needs to take account of that and let us know, and I think Christian's working on this, what are the ongoing implications and what do we think that we could accommodate, either because we now have more new ongoing funding, or there's a way of using reserves to account for ongoing funding. So we could set aside funding and reserves and allocate that for the 2 to 4 year period to provide ongoing funding. So there are ways to get around that, but we can't lose sight of the fact that we do need to account for it. So align with LIP, short-term or one-time only. I think, and this is one of the refinements from Washington County, the one-time only investments, we should pick things that either create efficiencies in our system or build capacity. And then, either sustainable with available operating funds, or we should set aside reserves. Things that can be deployed relatively quickly and that support upstream interventions, because those are, in the long run, more cost effective. So those are my guiding principles, but that kind of a framework is where I think we should start, and then measure the various investments based on that framework. A couple quick things about Bybee Lake while I'm hanging desperately onto the mic. I think a capital investment in Bybee Lakes, which is what they're asking for, would fit with those principles that I've just articulated. They're serving folks who are at the more downstream end of the continuum, which means people who can pay for their shelter, which I understand to be the model. They're in recovery. So it's downstream, it's not upstream. It's people who are further along the continuum towards being housed. And we need to support that part of the spectrum so folks don't lapse back into homelessness. I do have questions about their financial model. I'd like to understand why they seem to be struggling, not just in Multnomah County, but at the coast as well. We just got some more information. I appreciate that. I haven't had a chance to review it, so it might be in there. I'd like to understand why some of the private funders who have funded them are not continuing that funding, including, for example, United Way. So I think there's some questions, and I think the suggestion that we provide bridge housing as we evaluate the model, to me, that does make sense. I also want to note that there are other providers who are really struggling because of the gap between the funding that they get from public sources and the funding that they get from private sources. Bybee Lakes is not the only one. They are the ones who've, credit to them, very effective advocacy campaign, but other providers are in the same situation. So if we can't make these decisions in an ad hoc, one-off basis. We need to consider the rest of the spectrum. And I'll give one very small, but really important example. I just heard from New Avenues for Youth that they're going to have to eliminate 28 beds of transitional housing for youth, as well as day services for youth, if they don't get help filling their funding gap. Now, 28 beds doesn't sound like a lot of beds, but this is as upstream as it gets, intervening for youth who are experiencing homelessness, right? So that's just one example. I think whatever it is that we do with and for Bybee Lakes, we've got to consider the rest of providers who have been with us for a very long time, who've stretched themselves to do what we've asked them to do over the last 3 years, and are also struggling. So those are my thoughts on Bybee Lakes. I want to look at the information I've been given, but I do think a bridge solution of some kind makes sense.
Thank you, Chair. I had a couple questions. I don't know if our finance people are still talking about Bybee Lakes. Is it possible to get, like a preliminary review of their financials? I understand that we have those. I'd kind of like someone to review that and give me an assessment. I also have a question about their lease. My understanding is that they have $1 a year lease. I don't know when that lease is up. That'd be really critical information for this board to have. So I feel like we're running out of time if we're supposed to vote on this next week, and there's so many unanswered questions. So I don't know if that's possible, Chair, or do you have a response?
Yeah, we'll provide as much information as we have for them. I think one of the things was it wasn't the information that they share publicly around their finances isn't what you normally find for a nonprofit organization. There's a lot of questions that I have around that, which is one of the reasons why having a third party come in and do an overview of operations and financials and provide a report to this board by the end of the year was a really important contingency for an investment.
Okay. No, and I appreciate it. I think the 808,000 is, throwing them a lifeline, and then that would give us the needed time to make an informed decision. The other comments I have, Commissioner Jayapal, I appreciate, we haven't talked about what our process is. I mean, this feels very budget-like, but, as we know, a lot of times the budget is developed behind the scenes. And so I think it's important for this board to come to a decision about the process. Like, I'm not sure, none of us have said, how will we decide? I mean, I think, yes, many of our asks overlap. There needs to be a synthesis into whatever those buckets. I like your idea, Commissioner Jayapal, about, and Chair, about maybe following the LIP buckets, because we have to follow those buckets. But I think we have to talk about process. And Chair, maybe, I'm intrigued by your shelter flow through, and maybe there needs to be a continuum, and I'm not sure exactly where the gaps are in that continuum. So we need data to say, well, how many shelter beds do we need? How many family shelter beds do we need? How many individual? And I know that's a ton of work, but that's why, we're trying to figure out what the answer is when we haven't identified where the gaps are. And I don't know, it kind of looks like that's what you're talking about here, so I don't know.
Yeah, that's really how talking about the way that we look at, these things. I actually really loved the way that you introduced your proposals the other week when you really talked about the criteria you were using. I tried to mirror that in how I was delivering mine, because it is looking at where our system is not performing where it should be, and that's where the shelter, I've already had I've already given a directive that we need to be having our providers open all of the shelter beds that we're currently funding, right? We have providers that, because of workforce issues, because of, I think, the acuity of the folks that are in the shelters, have not gotten back to capacity. But as we're funding new beds, in partnership with the city, as we are having new shelters come online because construction work is being done on them, right? All of that. We also need to be making sure that we are improving deficiencies in the system in terms of throughput and output, and that's really what that $11 million proposal was about.
So, and I appreciate that. So I think,
and the long-term rental assistance is the same kind of deal, because we know we're getting people into housing. We don't know that we're keeping people successfully housed.
Yeah, so I guess if we could come to agreement on what are the criterion, and then based on that criterion that we all agree on, hopefully, then we can start placing those in the bucket to say, look, this is what we agreed on, and this is why this particular funding works or doesn't work. So I think there needs to be some process developed.
I totally agree, and I just would point to Commissioner Stegman. This is when I've said there's no plan, this is how I've broken it down to look at the sort of stepwise, recognizing it's a cycle, how we holistically can think about the system and break the pieces down and get those data points that you're talking about so that we can plug into a system and say, where do we need what and how it can flow through that system. And so I completely support that. What you have suggested, we do need a process, and just my guiding principles, because I actually have written this to constituents who write to me. I have 3 for this process for the one time only. One is investing boldly in projects that will make a difference rather than distributing money superficially across many different organizations or projects. Number 2, invest in capital projects where possible, as these can serve as the bedrock on which desperately needed services can be offered in the future and can be repurposed as needs change. And number 3, if we invest in services, this aligns with exactly what you were talking about, Chair. The following are, these services should be one time only, but lead to the optimization of efficiency of future county services through improved coordination, efficiency, and accountability.
I'm not going to take that as a conspiracy. So I have a couple thoughts about the proposals that have been put on the table and the conversation so far, but I also want to just put one other new proposal on the table. It's a Unite Oregon Hope Housing Project. It's a planned East Portland Housing Community Resiliency Hub, converting about 9,000 square foot parking lot on Southeast 122nd near Unite Oregon's headquarters into a 4-story building with 20 units. And it's about, the investment is $3.3 million. So it's one piece of a much larger funding package. But I'm happy to share the broader proposal with everybody as well, but I just want to put that on the table. And then just speaking to the process, my staff put together sort of where are the common buckets and themes, and actually there are, I think, a fair amount of commonalities across the proposals, and there's some places where there's not, but there is actually some big buckets, and I also think they follow along the themes that we've discussed here. They're capital focused. So for me, my guiding principles were sort of bold, big swings, and also acting with urgency on some things right away. Let's say yesterday, just driving all over outer Southeast Portland, I was trying to think about how the proposal of the underspend, which is $17 million, would actually have an impact on the encampments and all the humanitarian crisis on the streets in outer Southeast. And it was really hard for me to focus on what is that specific the outcome that's going to actually change things, and moving people from the streets to stability and some basic service through shelter gets people on a very different continuum. But what I'm going to be looking for is what is going to start moving people to a better place, because making a series of long-term investments and at the same time not acting with urgency, it's bad for, I think, the broader community, but also, most importantly, really bad for the people who are living on the streets without any basic services or supports. So I would hope that maybe we look at it, maybe there's a first tranche of sets of investments that are more urgent, that get that, you call it shelter throughput, but the variety of names are really looking at the acute issues of the day. And then, I would put Bybee Lakes in that, because if we lose the 175 beds, that's a lot. And they also have the potential to add about another 200. Absolutely, we should look at the finances, but also in our examination, we also need to act with urgency on that so that we can move ahead. But I would suggest that we have an initial set of investments that are the urgent ones, and using a set of criteria. And I see some common themes and places where there's investment that would fit into that category, and then have this broader, just the more extended conversation about some of the more complex, bigger investments that we need to do due diligence on, but that I also see across the proposals that there are similarities, whether it's the sobering center, long-term or recovery and stabilization housing, those types of things that may, if we wait to do the urgent investments till we get those down, I think we should separate them, keep it as a unified, coherent package, but actually move forward earlier rather than later, and take the time on the longer term investments to really build them out in a way that they're effective, that we have clear performance measurements, and that, but we don't hold up the more urgent investments. I say, school started today with lots of encampments by our schools, and I'll just speak for PPS. And I'm trying to think about going back to the community and saying, we're going to wait for 6 months or wait for 5 years before we address this. And I say it's not just the broader community that's impacted, but also the individuals who are living in horrible conditions on our streets with no basic services. So that would be the approach I would suggest. And I appreciate your investments. Again, I see there are a lot of similarities across the other ones that were offered. And I think we should get more specific. I'm not going to be just a flag. I'm not going to be comfortable voting for things in which, and later on, somebody else is going to decide, and then I find out that I voted for something that actually didn't have the impact that I thought it would or expected. So clarity is kind, I always say, because it makes, then we don't have people thinking that they're voting for something or taking action on something and expecting something and then it not happening. So it's much better to know that at the front end. So that's, I would ask for a lot more specificity.
No, that's okay. I think your battery died on this one is what happened. But I agree. But that's also why, for me, having for all of the things that we're moving forward, working with the Joint Office to have the outcomes that we're expecting, the how we're going to be measuring this, and all of that, 4 of those things, so that we can make sure down the line that these investments are actually fulfilling what the expectation was when we're voting on them as a board.
One of the things I was told is well, that will be said after the board votes on it. And to me, that's not going to be acceptable because it won't be, because I'm not going to vote on something that is decided after the vote. So I'm fine with whoever does it, whether it's the Joint Office, some other department, here at the board table, but I'm going to want to have that specificity beforehand versus, for example, the $10 million for providers. So that's on top of an 8% COLA. Is that the same providers? Who are those providers, and what are we expecting? What are we expecting from them? And those are the types of questions. And again, it doesn't matter to me who provides the information. I know there's a lot of expertise from our staff, so that would be ideal. I just want it before we vote on it, so we can have a discussion about it. So there's no, here's what we expected, but actually we got something else. So.
Completely agree.
Chair, could I suggest perhaps we could form a work group of our chiefs of staff, probably somebody from the Joint Office, probably Christian. I mean, I look at this as there's short-term, medium-term, long-term goals. And, we're being asked to look at this little pile of money when we're really trying to look at the whole continuum. And I think we need to be able to kind of separate everything out. This work group could also establish the criteria, and each one of us could say, here's how I came to my decisions. I think if we could get just some agreement on a framework of how to move forward. And while, I think I talked about Crowne Plaza, I do think that would be amazing, but we need partners. That is clearly, to me, a long-term goal. And we have to figure out, are we looking to spend this money in the short term, medium term, or long term? So I think if we had a framework, it would be really helpful for me to vote next week.
Okay.
I don't think we can vote next week.
I was just going to say,
okay.
I think that this was brought up in board staff this week, that was the day that we had originally planned for that, but that we are open to having that. I mean, it's about the process, right, and making sure that we have this opportunity to have this discussion. So I think that but when we're talking, I do want to differentiate between the vote that we would have for the corrective action plan with Metro and those investments, and then the vote that we would have on this unanticipated FY23. I mean, it's just so those are going to be two separate votes, and the timing of those don't have to be aligned. They can be aligned, but for basically writ large, like making sure that we have enough ample time for discussion and conversation and getting the questions answered. So I really appreciate the suggestion of getting our chiefs of staff together to work with the joint office to come up with that. There are so many staff in the audience. I know people have been taking notes on what we have been talking about, because I think as we talk about where our framework is for making these decisions, everybody's verbalized those, and we can I think that work isn't going to take as long as them. We can have a report back, I think, next week in terms of the outcomes of that and where we're in alignment, and then move from there.
Great, thank you.
I just want to make sure I understood. I do think that there's urgency around finalizing the cap. And Commissioner Berman-Edwards, I hear and understand your desire for more detail on that capacity building piece. But as I've said before, that addresses very specifically the reason for the underspending. And so before we can do anything else, we need to address the capacity issue. I think that there is more detail that staff can provide on how they're planning or proposing to do that. But I think it's really important that we get that funding out as soon as possible.
Okay.
I deeply disagree with the need to do it on the day that it's scheduled for. It can still be urgent and be thoughtful and get questions answered, especially in light of the audit that just came about and in light of the information we're going to get from HMA, that there's a lot that is happening that can inform these really major decisions. $10 million is a huge amount of money, and if we are not using it effectively for the organizations, I'm all for building capacity, but if we do it the same old way we've been doing it, it's not going to build effective capacity. So there's urgency, but we can wait a week, and it's not going to make a difference, but could inform our actions much better.
A couple things. First, that proposal comes directly from the providers. So I think in terms of figuring out what the most effective way to support providers is, they know very well what their circumstances are, and that proposal comes directly from what they have asked for. If it's a week delay, yes, is that the be all and end all? Probably not, but I think we get in a position of the week becoming a month, becoming several months, and then we will be back in the same situation of making a whole bunch of other investments that can't be carried out because our providers don't have the capacity. So I think there is a need both to take in the information that we get from HMA. I'm looking forward to hearing that. There's nothing in the audit that counters the idea of providing block grants. Their audit provides additional information, but there's nothing in there that suggests that this approach is not a good approach or an effective approach. And I think we need to, as others have said, do both immediate action and long-term planning. We've got to be able to do both.
I would say that what we've seen happening with those kinds of investments in the past, if we're expecting Bybee Lakes, for example, we're holding them to a standard that we are not holding the rest of our community-based organizations to. It's saying we need an audit on or a review of their finances before we decide to invest in them. I can support that, but I also think we need a review and understanding, which is why I have suggested investing in that evaluation done quickly for what our best practices, what an outside organization saying, what do we need here to make our organizations function most effectively. It's a support for them to do the work, and it can only benefit the organizations, the county, and the people being served.
So I will say one of the things that's different between Bybee Lakes and other providers, especially those who are going to be eligible for the grants, is that those are contracted providers with Multnomah County already with the joint office. So they have been through a different process already for going through an RFP, for going through the contract process, for having contract management. So there is a difference between that and Bybee Lakes, who we don't have a joint office contract with, who haven't gone through the same things. I agree, and I will say that I have the message that I have shared with our providers in the meetings that I've had with them and the meetings that staff has had with them is that we are being, that we want to provide them with the resources and the investments that they need to be able to do what we're asking them. And we are also holding them to be accountable for the outcomes that they want. And I think that is something different than what they necessarily have heard before. So I don't disagree with you, but I do want to say there's a difference in Bybee Lakes because we have a different relationship with them than we do with other providers.
Well, I'll just say with the provider money, and again, it's $10 million, and I'm thinking that's a down payment on a sobering center, lots of recovery housing, which we know we need. I mean, my questions were so simple as simple as, who is it going to? Because there's like one sentence that says $10 million to providers. And so getting that list, how much they're getting, and then one thing the audit said is what happens often is that we change and there's no outcomes necessarily connected to the $10 million, so no performance metrics. And then one thing the audit said was that often the metrics get changed when when providers don't meet the goals that had been set for them. And so I think we have a sort of duty of care and a financial obligation to ask those questions. And I think the audit also made a very clear case that we need to support providers, but that's not just a blank check. We need to know what is it that we're getting, and my understanding is also that's on top of there was already been an 8% COLA that went to this is a question I had for staff that already went out. So it was 2%, but it was on top of 6%, so for a total of 8%. And then is this enough, or is there going to be another ask? And I just think a line item for $10 million that has no specific metrics, and again, I'm trying to tie it back to the person I saw living in horrible conditions. Well, a lot of people I saw living in horrible conditions yesterday. Like, how is that going to help them? Are we going to get more shelter beds? Are there going to be more navigators? Like, what is that? And it's just going to be a question I have because I don't have the information, and I may end up being the biggest champion of it and more, but I don't know that because I don't see what it is, and I can't just vote for it as I hope this is what somebody said they needed, because we have a lot of need. So that would just be my point of view on that specific piece of the underspend versus like the corrective action plan.
Okay, so appreciate that. We will get some more information, and Commissioner Bermenders will make sure that we get your questions answered in writing. Apologize that hadn't happened yet, but I do appreciate the conversation. I think we have some good, so we'll direct staff to start meeting to talk about the kind of the principles and guidelines that we're using to make this decision, and then we will circle back. So appreciate this. We'll take a look at the calendar in terms of what is ahead for the plans for the future briefings and board meetings, and really factor in some more time in the work to be able to make sure we've got the information we need and the time for conversation that we need, knowing that we need to move with alacrity in terms of getting some of these dollars out into the community. So appreciate this. I think this is second one. I think it's feeling good. I think it's feeling better. I was going to say we're gonna get more robust audio-visual equipment, but appreciate all this. So we will be back on Thursday for our regular board meeting, and with that, we are adjourned.